Hey everybody, so to pick up on the second video on our race and ethnicity section, I want to get into the language piece, which I think is a really important part of the section. One, because language filters everything in our life. How not only how we speak about things, but how we take in information is filtered through language. And so make sure like for our language, like know the term panethnic label and how we often use these labels to categorize large groups of people that mask a lot of diversity within that. The example being, here Asian Americans. Asian Americans is a label that we use for a huge swath of people that are very different. For example, if you are a Chinese American versus if you're a Japanese American, there are lots of cultural differences. There's language differences, and so just make sure that these labels tend to be very broad. So we always realize that these broad labels do mask a lot of differences and diversity and uniqueness within them. Now, I want to focus particularly though on the language piece on how we use coded language a lot in the U.S. because coded language has been historically been used as a weapon. It's dangerous, and it still exists today. In my world in criminology, we spend a lot of time unpacking the tough on crime era that's been dominating for decades and finally starting to see reform to it, and the war on drugs era. These eras were filled with a lot of coded coded language regarding race, and it's has very clear origins, especially during the Nixon administration. A lot of Nixonian politics was housed in painting civil rights protesters as criminals. Nixon called them hoodlums, said that they were causing chaos in the street and then needed to restore law and order. So really, a lot of this law and order rhetoric that still exists today originated in an attempt to, one, be opposed to civil rights protesters, but also to paint them as hoodlums. And so this ended up becoming really housing a lot of loaded racial terminology within that. Still to this day, you will see, for example, the use of the term urban and underdeveloped as racist code words. And in politics, a lot of times this takes the form of what we call dog whistle politics. And this is dangerous in a lot of ways, but it's especially hard to address because, for example, if a politician uses, dog whistle politics, uses this loaded racial terminology, the intention is clear. But since the person is not saying something overtly racist, like a racial slur, then it's easy for them to deny it. And then if we take that explanation on face, it masks all of the loaded racism in that language, in that terminology. So be very cognizant of how this terminology operates and be able, as you read through the section, to think through how it shows up a lot. Like I said, in criminology, it's all over how we describe crime and criminals and drug use and things of that nature. It very much has a racist connotation. And a lot of that comes from the mere fact that the tough on crime and war on drugs era saw just absolutely huge numbers of people of color, particularly black men, being swept into the criminal justice system as a result of, really extremely punitive policies around drugs, over policing of black communities. And then all of a sudden the language around crime began to equate blackness when, as I highlight continually in the reading and lecture notes, doesn't actually align with data. For example, a lot of what was driving the mass incarceration epidemic we have today and sweeping so many black men into jails and prisons related to war on drugs, tough on drugs policies in which black Americans were arrested and incarcerated at much higher rates than white Americans. But in reality, drug use is essentially almost occurs at the same rate across racial lines. In fact, white Americans tend to use illegal drugs at a slightly higher rate, but how those drugs are policed and incarcerated doesn't actually reflect usage rates. But it allowed for this language around criminality to be equated with black Americans because of these policies and policing tactics that target those communities. And then institutional racism, as I mentioned before, or in the first video, personal racism we know well, but institutional racism is really important. But it often occurs. It occurs invisibly until you take the time to actually identify it and try to dismantle it. So institutional racism are when there are actual laws and policies and practices that perpetuate racial inequalities. As I mentioned before, these are less obvious because what you're going to see is if you have a law that perpetuates inequality, the law is going to be colorblind on its face, meaning it's going to say nothing about race in the language. However, the way the law is written and the way it's implemented has a clear disparate racial impact. And returning back to the war on drugs examples, the war on drugs legislation that was passed in the 80s in the Reagan administration continued during the Bush administration and was accelerated during the Clinton administration. This war on drugs, tough on crime legislation, there was nothing around these laws and policies that said anything about the race of offenders. However, these laws were written in a way and implemented in a way that was always going to have a disproportionate impact on people of color, and it was very intentional. And we have a lot of good works, like you're going to read the new Jim Crow to see just how intentional that was. And so with these laws, the best example is always going to be the crack versus powder cocaine example. So it was part of the war on drugs legislation. They implemented mandatory minimums, which a mandatory minimum says if you get convicted of X crime, this is the minimum amount of prison time you must serve. These mandatory minimums were extremely harsh in war on drugs legislation because the argument was, the harsher the threat of punishment, the less likely it is that individuals will commit that crime. But in reality, deterrence literature is extremely fraught, and most research finds that more punitive policies, policies with heavier punishment, don't actually deter offending. But that was still passed. And so around drugs, all of a sudden in the war on drugs era, the mandatory minimums for drug offenses were extremely harsh. The idea, we make the punishment so harsh, people are not going to use drugs. Well, what they did in the laws with cocaine is powder cocaine and crack cocaine. It's essentially the same drug, just taking two different forms. However, crack cocaine is predominantly used in Black communities, and powder cocaine was predominantly used in white communities and also among celebrities and people of power. Now, if the goal is just to deter cocaine use, you say, the mandatory minimum is going to be the same, of course, because cocaine is cocaine, whether it's in crack form or powder form. However, this law was written in a way that there was a 100-to-1 ratio, meaning it took 100 times as much powder cocaine than crack cocaine in order to meet the mandatory minimum. So let's take the mandatory minimum for crack cocaine. It's going to take 100 times as much powder cocaine to reach the same mandatory minimum for powder cocaine as already existed for crack cocaine. So what that means is cocaine usage is not going to be punished at the same rate. Crack cocaine users are going, which is predominant Black communities, they're going to be punished much harder than powder cocaine users used primarily by white Americans. And so this is institutional racism at its best, because it was a policy and a law that was written in no way made reference to race, but when it was written in that way, it was always going to disproportionately impact people of color, particularly Black men, and it was always going to further drive inequality, because once you become part of the criminal justice system, it becomes nearly impossible to leave it, but also to be successful when you have that tag of now, especially a felony that's coming with these very harsh drug laws. It's very hard to escape that. And so that is just a classic example of institutional racism in the U.S. And we have lots of examples of this. An example I write a lot about in the reading and lecture notes, and that you're going to read a lot, if you take Dr. Finn's geography classes or really any sociological class, you're going to talk about racial redlining. Racial redlining is still, its impacts are still, it's still impacting us today. And racial redlining was actual federal housing policies that identified zip codes where African Americans could live, and it identifies zip codes where white Americans could live. And essentially the way it worked is that policymakers literally drew lines around certain neighborhoods and said, okay, this neighborhood is for Black Americans. However, Black Americans cannot live in this zip code we have designed for white Americans. Now, as you can imagine, the neighborhoods or zip codes that were designated for white Americans were, one, better, more affluent neighborhoods. They were also less likely to have environmental issues, environmental risk. They had better schools, and in everything that ties in. Think how much tied into your geography where you grew up. Where you grow up determines what school you go to, who you interact with socially, the access to neighborhood resources you have. So this was very intentional, trying to not allow Black Americans to move into predominantly white neighborhoods with more resources, with better schools, with less crime, with less environmental hazards. So if you were a Black family applying for a loan for a mortgage during this time, that loan application would be denied if you're applying for a loan for a house in a neighborhood designated for white families. So you were essentially forced to buy homes, if you could afford to buy a home and got the loan to do it, in a neighborhood that was considered not as good a neighborhood. That means your home value is not going to increase at the same rate that the white family's home value is going to increase. It meant your kids had to grow up and go to worse schools. It meant your kids had to be exposed to environmental risk that white kids were not being exposed to. And so these had major ramifications. And on top of it, the primary way that we fund schools is based on property tax rate. So the more your property is worth, the higher your property tax rate is. So it becomes this loop in which the higher your property tax rates are in a neighborhood, the more funding from the state goes into your schools. The better the schools are, also the more the homes are going to be worth, because people want to move places where their kids can go to good schools. And so it becomes this loop that feeds into each other. And then that's going to make your home value continue to go up. And as white families, you're accruing all this wealth because you say you move in, your home is worth $200,000. When you leave, your home is now worth $500,000. You've made $300,000 on your purchase. That is wealth that you've accrued. That's a safety net for your family. It's also a huge chunk of change that you're going to pass on to the next generation. At the same time this was happening, Black families were either denied the ability to buy a home, or were only able to buy a home where home values were not increasing at that same rate, and their kids and families were exposed to worse living conditions. And so all of a sudden, let's say the Black and white family had the same employment and wealth markers at the beginning. The Black family moves into a home for $100,000. Its value only increases $40,000 because of the net ramifications of the neighborhood. Whereas that white family's home increased by $300,000. All of a sudden, look how the difference in wealth amounts is being handed to the next generation. And that's why we're seeing now, we talk a lot about the income gap, but one of the biggest concerns, I think, is around the racial wealth gap, in which you see and we're about to see the biggest transfer of wealth in American history as baby boomers pass away and that wealth is passed on to their children. We are going to see the wealth gap that already is huge between white and Black families expand exponentially. And wealth dictates so much of our everyday lives. It gives us safety nets. It allows you to take risk and not fear taking risk. It allows you to be able to move to places you want to move to. All these kind of things that are embedded in the wealth structure. And so that's an example of where a policy that perpetuated inequality continues to have ramifications today. And that also, if you notice, our neighborhoods today are just as segregated as they've ever been. We don't think about segregation now because we think, oh, we're past civil rights, we're good. There's integration. However, our neighborhoods and schools still remain hyper segregated, and a lot of this can be tied directly back to institutional discrimination in the form of things like racial redlining policies. Okay, I will do one short video to just wrap everything up, and then we will finish up this section and move into our section on gender.